The storm gathers. The rain lashed against the window of the Matthews' modest two-bedroom apartment. The sound of thunder rumbled in the distance, a fitting backdrop to the storm brewing within the home. Sarah Matthews sat at the kitchen table, staring at the crumpled eviction notice that had been hastily shoved through their door just hours earlier. Her hands trembled as she smoothed out the paper, reading the harsh words yet again. Her chest tightened with despair. "Ethan, what are we going to do?" she whispered, her voice cracking. Across the room, her 17-year-old son stood with a steely expression, his fists clenched at his sides. "We fight, Mom," Ethan said firmly, walking over to stand beside her. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his youthful determination shining through his worried eyes. "We can't just let Mr. Granger push us around." Sarah let out a bitter laugh. "Fight? How, Ethan? I've already tried everything. I've pleaded with him, asked for an extension, but he doesn't care. He's set on getting us out of here." Mr. Granger, their landlord, was notorious in the neighborhood. He owned several low-income housing units and had a reputation for evicting tenants over the slightest infractions. Rumors swirled about his shady dealings and his willingness to exploit legal loopholes to maximize his profits. For Sarah, a single mother struggling with mounting medical bills and a part-time job that barely covered the essentials, Granger was more than just a landlord. He was a tyrant. Ethan leaned over the table, his eyes locking with his mother's. "Then we take him to court," he said, his voice steady. Sarah shook her head, her shoulders slumping. "Ethan, that's not how the world works. We can't afford a lawyer, and even if we could, Granger's got resources we can't match. He'll bury us in legal fees." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Then I'll do it," he said simply. Sarah stared at him, her mouth slightly open. "You'll do what?" "I'll represent us," Ethan said, his voice filled with a confidence that belied his age. "I've been reading up on tenant laws for weeks now, ever since Granger started sending those bogus maintenance fines. I know what he's doing is illegal. I can prove it." "Ethan," Sarah said softly, shaking her head again, "you're just a teenager. The court isn't going to take you seriously. And what if you mess up? We could lose everything." "But we're going to lose everything anyway if we don't fight," Ethan countered, his voice rising with passion. "Mom, Granger is counting on us being too scared to stand up to him. That's how he gets away with this. But I've been researching, and I know there are laws to protect us. We just have to be brave enough to use them." Sarah looked at her son, her heart swelling with both pride and apprehension. Ethan had always been mature for his age, but this was a monumental undertaking. The idea of her teenage son standing in a courtroom, facing off against a seasoned attorney representing a wealthy landlord, seemed almost absurd. And yet, as she gazed into Ethan's determined eyes, a small spark of hope flickered within her. "How would you even begin?" she asked tentatively. Ethan's face lit up. He pulled out a notebook from his backpack and flipped it open, revealing pages filled with handwritten notes and printed articles. "I've been researching tenant rights in our state," he explained, his finger tracing a highlighted passage. "Granger's eviction notice doesn't comply with the legal requirements. For one, he didn't give proper notice. And those fines he's been charging, they're completely baseless. If we can prove he's been acting in bad faith, we might have a case." Sarah glanced at the pages, the words blurring together as tears welled up in her eyes. "Ethan, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll let me try," Ethan said, his voice softening. "Mom, I know this sounds crazy, but I believe we can do this. And if we don't, we'll always wonder what could have been." After a long moment, Sarah nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Okay." Ethan grinned, relief washing over him. "All right then. First thing tomorrow, I'll start putting together our case." The next morning, the apartment buzzed with energy. Ethan transformed their small living room into a makeshift legal office, spreading out documents, sticky notes, and legal textbooks borrowed from the local library. He worked tirelessly, poring over statutes and case law. his focus unshakable. Sarah watched from the doorway, a mix of awe and anxiety swirling within her. "You're really serious about this, aren't you?" she asked. Ethan looked up and gave her a reassuring smile. "I am. And I'm going to need your help, Mom. You're the one who's lived through all of this. Your testimony is going to be the most important part of our case." Sarah nodded, feeling the surge of determination. If her son was willing to fight for their home, she owed it to him to do the same. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan's resolve only grew stronger. He spent hours at the local courthouse, observing hearings and taking notes. He reached out to tenant advocacy groups, seeking advice and guidance. Despite the challenges, he remained undeterred, his confidence bolstered by the support of his mother and the knowledge that he was fighting for what was right. But not everyone shared his optimism. "You really think you can beat Granger in court?" Mrs. Lopes, their elderly neighbor, asked one afternoon as Ethan returned from the courthouse. "That man's got lawyers who chew kids like you for breakfast." Ethan smiled politely. "Maybe, but I'm not going to back down without a fight." Word of Ethan's determination spread throughout the building, and soon other tenants began sharing their stories of unfair treatment at Granger's hands. It became clear that Sarah and Ethan weren't alone. This wasn't just about their apartment. It was about standing up to a bully who had terrorized an entire community. By the time the court date arrived, Ethan had built a solid case. He walked into the courtroom with his head held high, his mother by his side. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as people filed in, curious to see the teenager who dared to take on a powerful landlord. Granger sat at the defendant's table, flanked by his high-priced attorney. He smirked when he saw Ethan, clearly underestimating the young man. But Ethan didn't let it faze him. He was ready. As the judge entered the room and the hearing began, Ethan took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the moment he had been preparing for. He glanced at his mother, who gave him an encouraging nod, and then turned his attention to the judge. "Your Honor," Ethan began, his voice steady and confident, "my name is Ethan Matthews, and I'm here to represent my mother and myself in this case. We believe we've been wrongfully evicted by Mr. Granger, and I'm prepared to present evidence to support our claim." The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by the sight of a teenager representing himself in court. "Proceed, Mr. Matthews," she said, her tone neutral but curious. Ethan launched into his opening statement, outlining the key points of their case. He presented evidence of Granger's repeated violations of tenant laws, from improper notice to fabricated fines. He cited specific statutes and precedents, his preparation evident in every word. As the hearing progressed, it became clear that Ethan was no ordinary teenager. He was articulate, knowledgeable, and unshakable under pressure. Even Granger's attorney, who had initially dismissed him as a joke, began to take him seriously. By the end of the first day, the courtroom was abuzz with whispers of admiration and disbelief. Ethan had not only held his own, he had made a compelling case. But the battle was far from over. As they left the courtroom that evening, Ethan knew the hardest part was still ahead. Granger and his attorney weren't going down without a fight, and the next phase of the trial would test every ounce of his courage and determination. Still, as he walked out of the courthouse, his mother by his side, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. For the first time in weeks, it seemed like they had a chance, a real chance, to stand up to Granger and win. And no matter what happened next, Ethan knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. The battle lines are drawn. The next morning, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, poring over the legal documents he had assembled, his laptop glowing softly in the dim apartment. Sunlight streamed in through the cracked blinds, illuminating the stacks of papers, legal textbooks, and his own scribbled notes. Sleep-deprived but unwavering, he flipped through a copy of the state's tenant rights handbook, his fingers tracing the fine print as he committed each key detail to memory. Sarah watched from across the room, sipping a cup of lukewarm coffee. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, but there was a new resilience in her posture, a quiet hope that had taken root despite the fear gnawing at her heart. "Are you sure about this, Ethan?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, facing Mr. Granger's lawyer in court, what if they twist things around? What if they make it look like we're the ones in the wrong?" Ethan looked up, his hazel eyes filled with determination. "Mom, I've been over everything. Granger's eviction notice doesn't hold up. He's been using intimidation tactics to get people out, and I have the evidence to prove it." He gestured to a file bursting with documents. "It's not just us, either. The Lopeses, the Carters, even Mr. Pottle. They've all had the same bogus fines and threats." Sarah sighed, running a hand through her frazzled hair. "I just don't want you getting hurt, sweetheart. This isn't a high school debate. This is real life." "I know, Mom," Ethan said gently, reaching out to squeeze her hand. "But if we don't stand up now, we'll lose everything. And not just us, everyone Granger's been bullying." Sarah managed a weak smile, nodding. "Then I trust you, Ethan." With renewed determination, Ethan focused back on his notes. He had a plan, but he needed to make sure it was airtight. He had learned enough about tenant law to know that cases like theirs often came down to technicalities, and Granger's lawyer was likely to exploit any loophole they could find. Just as he was about to dive back into his research, there was a sharp knock at the door. Sarah flinched instinctively, fear flashing in her eyes. Ethan stood, his jaw tightening. "I'll get it," he said. He opened the door to find a tall man in a crisp navy suit standing on the doorstep. His salt and pepper hair was slicked back, and his sharp features bore an expression of smug superiority. In his hand, he held a leather briefcase that screamed wealth and power. "Good morning," the man said smoothly, his voice dripping with condescension. "I'm Gerald Whittaker, Mr. Granger's legal counsel." Ethan stood his ground, his fists clenching at his sides. "What do you want?" Whittaker smirked. "I thought I'd stop by and offer you some friendly advice. You're young, Mr. Matthews. Ambitious, perhaps, but naive. If you drop this little stunt of yours, Mr. Granger is willing to offer you let's call it a grace period, to vacate the premises quietly." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to let it show. "We're not leaving," he said firmly, "and we're definitely not backing down." Whittaker chuckled, shaking his head. "Listen, kid, courtrooms aren't won with guts and ambition. They're won with experience, knowledge, and money, none of which you have." He leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "If you go through with this, we will bury you in paperwork, legal fees, and motions you can't even begin to understand. Save yourself the trouble and walk away." Ethan stood his ground, his jaw tightening. "Tell Mr. Granger we'll see him in court." Whittaker's smirk faltered for a brief moment before he straightened up, adjusting his tie. "Suit yourself, kid, but don't say I didn't warn you." As Whittaker turned and strode away, Sarah appeared behind Ethan, gripping his arm. "Ethan, what if he's right? What if we're in over our heads?" Ethan exhaled slowly, watching Whittaker disappear down the hallway. "Maybe we are, Mom," he admitted, "but we're not giving up." In the days leading up to the court hearing, Ethan left no stone unturned. He pored over every detail of their lease agreement, looking for any inconsistencies or breaches by Granger. He gathered testimony from their neighbors, each willing to share their experiences of harassment and intimidation tactics. He even visited the local tenant advocacy office, where a paralegal named Ms. Thornton offered valuable advice. "Judges like facts, Ethan," she had told him, adjusting her glasses. "Emotion is important, but what's going to win this case is solid evidence. Focus on the lease violations, the improper notices, and the patterns of harassment." Ethan took her advice to heart, compiling a compelling argument supported by timelines, documented incidents, and even photos of neglected maintenance issues that had been ignored for months. Despite his confidence, doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. What if Whittaker was right? What if he got something wrong, and it cost them everything? On the night before the hearing, Sarah found him sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the thick binder in front of him. She sat beside him and ran a gentle hand through his hair. "I'm so proud of you, Ethan," she whispered. "No matter what happens tomorrow, I want you to know that." Ethan swallowed hard and nodded. "Thanks, Mom. I hope it's enough." She smiled softly. "It is, because you're fighting for what's right." The day of the hearing arrived with a heavy sense of anticipation. Ethan and Sarah walked into the courthouse, their footsteps echoing against the polished floors. The courtroom was already half filled with curious onlookers, neighbors, reporters who had caught wind of the story, and even a few legal interns eager to see how it would play out. Mr. Granger sat smugly at the defendant's table, dressed in an expensive charcoal suit. Whittaker sat beside him, rifling through a stack of neatly organized documents with the air of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. Ethan took his place at the plaintiff's table, his binder clutched tightly in his hands. As the judge entered and the courtroom fell silent, Ethan took a deep breath. Case number 45,821. Matthews versus Granger, the judge announced, glancing over the paperwork. She looked up, her eyes settling on Ethan. "Mr. Matthews, I see you're representing yourself today. Are you prepared to proceed?" Ethan stood, his palms sweating but his voice steady. "Yes, Your Honor." Whittaker smirked, leaning back in his chair with an air of amusement. Ethan cleared his throat and began. "Your Honor, my mother and I have been tenants in Mr. Granger's building for the past 3 years. Over the past year, we've received multiple unfounded fines, harassment, and now, an improper eviction notice. I'd like to present evidence that Mr. Granger has been engaging in a pattern of unlawful behavior to force low-income tenants out in favor of wealthier ones." The judge raised an eyebrow, motioning for him to continue. Ethan opened his binder and began laying out his case, point by point, fact by fact. He presented documents, testimonies, and even recordings of conversations with Granger's property managers, highlighting the inconsistencies in their enforcement of rules. As Ethan spoke, the smirk on Whittaker's face slowly faded. The judge leaned forward, clearly intrigued. By the time Ethan finished his presentation, the courtroom was silent, all eyes on the teenager who had just gone toe-to-toe with a high-powered attorney. The judge leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, Mr. Matthews. I must say, you've presented a compelling argument." Granger's face paled, and Whittaker shifted uncomfortably. Ethan held his breath, waiting for the judge's next words, words that could change everything. Cracks in the facade. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he took his seat, his hands trembling slightly beneath the table. The courtroom's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow over the polished wood and somber faces. His mother, Sarah, squeezed his hand under the table, offering a silent but powerful message. "You've got this." Across the aisle, Mr. Granger sat stiffly, his expression a mixture of impatience and annoyance. His lawyer, Gerald Whittaker, flipped through his legal pad with mechanical precision, his eyes narrowed in concentration. Ethan knew they were taking him more seriously now. Gone was the smirk Whittaker had worn earlier. In its place was a tight-lipped determination. The judge cleared her throat, drawing everyone's attention back to the proceedings. "Mr. Whittaker, your response." Whittaker stood, adjusting his pristine navy suit. "Your Honor, while the young Mr. Matthews has put on an admirable display of enthusiasm, I must remind the court that enthusiasm does not equal legal standing. The Matthews family's lease clearly outlines penalties for property damage and failure to comply with building codes. Mr. Matthews has not provided any credible evidence to refute these violations." Ethan's jaw tightened. He's trying to paint us as careless tenants, he thought. But he was ready for this. Before the judge could respond, Ethan stood abruptly. "Your Honor, if I may, I'd like to provide evidence that not only refutes Mr. Whittaker's claims, but proves a pattern of predatory behavior by Mr. Granger." The judge gave him a scrutinizing look before nodding. "Proceed, Mr. Matthews." Ethan stepped forward, his hand surprisingly steady as he flipped open a thick binder and pulled out several papers. "This," he said, handing one to the court clerk, "is a copy of our original lease agreement. Nowhere in this document does it mention additional monthly fines for supposed property damage without prior inspections. Yet over the past year, we've been charged over a dozen penalties without a single inspection report to verify these claims." Whittaker's lips pressed into a thin line. "Your Honor, these charges were standard policy." Ethan raised his voice slightly, pressing forward. "If that were true, why have other tenants in the same building received identical charges, often in the exact same amounts, regardless of the condition of their apartments?" He produced another set of documents, passing them to the clerk. "I have sworn statements from several tenants detailing similar experiences. Fines ranging from minor infractions, like having a welcome mat outside their door, to ridiculous ones, like excessive noise when they weren't even home." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Some of their neighbors sat in the back, nodding as Ethan spoke. Mrs. Lopez, clutching her purse tightly, whispered something to Mr. Patel, who looked both impressed and relieved. The judge took a moment to scan the documents before turning to Whittaker. "Mr. Whittaker, can you provide documentation supporting these fines?" Whittaker coughed, shuffling his papers. "Your Honor, my client." "Yes or no, Mr. Whittaker?" The judge interrupted sharply. Whittaker hesitated. "Not at this time, Your Honor." Ethan seized the opportunity. "And that's because they don't exist. These charges were fabricated to pressure tenants into leaving. Furthermore, my mother has repeatedly requested proper maintenance for critical issues, leaks, electrical problems, but was ignored. Yet, when she reported these concerns, Mr. Granger responded by increasing our rent and threatening eviction." The judge's brows furrowed. "Is this true, Mr. Whittaker?" Whittaker cast a glare toward Granger, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "We follow standard maintenance protocol, Your Honor." Ethan wasn't done. "Then explain why, after my mom filed a formal complaint with the housing authority, Mr. Granger served us an eviction notice citing false lease violations within 24 hours. He pulled out an official report from the housing authority. I have documentation showing they opened an investigation into this property's conditions, which aligns suspiciously with the timing of our eviction notice." Granger's face turned an ugly shade of red, and he leaned toward Whittaker, whispering furiously. The lawyer's polished demeanor cracked for the first time. The judge sighed, tapping her pen against the desk. "It's beginning to appear as though there are inconsistencies in Mr. Granger's property management practices." She fixed Whittaker with a sharp look. "Mr. Whittaker, I suggest you tread carefully here. I don't take kindly to landlords who exploit tenants." Ethan felt a surge of confidence. He had them on the ropes, but he knew they wouldn't go down without a fight. Whittaker straightened, clearly trying to regain his composure. "Your Honor, while Mr. Matthews' efforts are commendable, I must point out that this is an emotional appeal, not a legal one. The fact remains that the Matthews family owes outstanding rent, and regardless of any alleged infractions, non-payment is grounds for eviction." Sarah stiffened beside Ethan. This was their weakest point. With her illness and medical expenses, they had fallen behind a couple of months, and Granger was exploiting that fact. Ethan swallowed hard but nodded. "You're right, Mr. Whittaker. We did fall behind." He reached into his binder again and produced yet another document. "But I'd like to introduce this into evidence." The judge examined it and raised an eyebrow. "A ledger of payments." Ethan nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. This shows that despite our financial difficulties, we made partial payments every month, never missing entirely. In fact, I have a letter from our bank showing that 3 of our checks were never cashed by Mr. Granger's office, even though they were received." Gasps rippled through the room again. Ethan turned to the judge. "We believe Mr. Granger intentionally avoided processing our payments to make it appear that we were in default. Furthermore, I have emails where my mother reached out multiple times to resolve the issue, only to be ignored." The judge leaned back, considering Ethan's words carefully. "This is troubling." Whittaker's face paled, and Granger looked ready to explode. "Your Honor, I suggest," the judge interrupted, her voice firm, "that Mr. Granger reconsider his actions in light of this new evidence." She peered down at Ethan with a hint of admiration. "Mr. Matthews, you've presented a compelling argument. If your claim's hold under further review, we may be looking at a case of retaliatory eviction." Sarah squeezed Ethan's hand so tightly he thought she might break it. He didn't care. He could feel the tide shifting in their favor. The judge continued, "This court will reconvene in 2 days to allow for further evidence submission and review of the defendant's financial records. In the meantime, the eviction is temporarily stayed." Ethan's knees nearly buckled in relief. A temporary stay meant they wouldn't be thrown out, at least not yet. As the court adjourned, Whittaker and Granger stormed out, their whispers heated and hurried. Sarah hugged Ethan tightly, tears of relief streaming down her face. "You did it," she whispered. "You actually did it." Ethan smiled, exhausted but victorious. "Not yet, Mom," he said, "but we're not going down without a fight." And for the first time in months, he truly believed they might have a chance to win. The web of deceit. The courtroom buzz lingered in Ethan's mind long after they left. He replayed every moment over and over as he and his mother walked home. Sarah's steps were lighter than they'd been in weeks, and Ethan could see a glimmer of hope in her eyes, but his mind was already racing toward what came next. Their temporary victory was exactly that, temporary. Whittaker was a seasoned lawyer, and Ethan knew he'd spend the next 2 days trying to discredit their evidence. If they were going to hold their ground, Ethan had to dig deeper and find the kind of proof that couldn't be refuted. That evening, Ethan sat at the cluttered kitchen table, a pile of papers spread before him. He scanned every page, looking for something, anything that could strengthen their case. His mother rested on the couch, her exhaustion catching up to her, while the apartment seemed quieter than usual. Just as Ethan began to feel the weight of the task pressing down on him, his phone buzzed. It was an email from Miss Thornton, the paralegal from the tenant advocacy office. Subject: potential lead. "Hi, Ethan. I did some digging after we spoke last. There might be something you can use. Check the records for Granger's other properties. You'll find he's been in legal trouble before, though the cases never made it to court. Seems like he has a history of settlements. Let me know if you need help accessing the public records. Best, Ms. Thornton." Ethan's pulse quickened. Legal trouble. Settlements. He grabbed his laptop and immediately started searching for property records connected to Granger's name. It didn't take long to find a trail, lawsuits filed by tenants at his other buildings. Most were dismissed or settled quietly, but the patterns were glaringly similar. Unexplained fines, maintenance negligence, sudden rent hikes, and mysterious eviction notices. "Mom," Ethan called, startling Sarah awake. She rubbed her eyes and sat up groggily. "What is it?" Ethan turned the laptop toward her. "Look at this. Granger's been pulling the same stunts at his other properties. This isn't just about us. This is how he does business." Sarah leaned closer, squinting at the screen. "How did we not know about this?" "Because he's been paying people off or scaring them into dropping their cases." Ethan scrolled through the list of names attached to the lawsuits. One name caught his eye: Marcy Dillard. Unlike the others, her case hadn't been dismissed or settled. It had been dismissed by request of the plaintiff. "Why would someone drop a case like this voluntarily?" Ethan muttered. Sarah frowned. Maybe she got tired of fighting. Or maybe something else happened. Ethan nodded slowly. He knew he had to find out. If Granger had a history of silencing tenants, it could blow the entire case wide open. The next day, Ethan tracked down Marcy Dillard's contact information. She lived in a modest home on the other side of the city, far from Granger's properties. When she answered the door, Ethan saw a woman in her early 40s with tired eyes and a guarded expression. "Ms. Dillard?" Ethan asked, holding his binder close to his chest. "My name is Ethan Matthews. I'm a tenant in one of Mr. Granger's buildings. I'm representing my mom in a case against him." Marcy's eyes widened slightly, but her expression remained cautious. "What do you want from me?" "I saw your name on a lawsuit against Granger," Ethan explained. "I was hoping you could tell me what happened. It might help us." Marcy hesitated, glancing over her shoulder before stepping outside and closing the door behind her. "That was a long time ago," she said, her voice low. "I don't want to get involved." "Please," Ethan pleaded. "We're trying to stop him from doing this to anyone else. I saw the pattern in his other properties, but I need more than that. Anything you can tell me could make a difference." Marcy crossed her arms, her gaze shifting to the ground. For a long moment, Ethan thought she would turn him away. But then she sighed heavily. "Granger, he's ruthless. When I tried to fight back, he didn't just threaten me. He went after my job, my family. I dropped the case because he made it clear he wouldn't stop until I was ruined." Ethan's stomach churned. "Did you have evidence? Anything you kept?" Marcy nodded slowly. "I did. Emails, photos, even a recording of him admitting he was trying to force me out. But I destroyed most of it when I dropped the case. I didn't want him coming after me anymore." Ethan's heart sank, but Marcy wasn't finished. "I didn't destroy everything," she added, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's a recording. I kept a copy, just in case." Ethan's eyes widened. "Do you still have it?" Marcy hesitated again, then motioned for him to wait. She disappeared inside her house, and a few minutes later, she returned with a small USB drive. "This is it," she said, handing it to him. "But be careful. Granger's dangerous. He won't go down without a fight." Ethan nodded solemnly. "Thank you. I promise, we'll make this count." Back at home, Ethan plugged the USB drive into his laptop. His mom sat beside him, her anxiety palpable as the file loaded. The recording was grainy, but the voices were clear. "Listen, lady," Granger's voice growled, unmistakably arrogant. "I don't care what your lease says. You either pay up or get out. And if you try to take this to court, I'll make sure you regret it." Ethan's stomach turned as the recording continued, laying bare Granger's tactics in shocking detail. This was the smoking gun they needed. Proof of his bullying, manipulative behavior. "This changes everything," Sarah said, her voice trembling with a mix of hope and disbelief. Ethan nodded, determination burning in his chest. "We're going to win this, Mom. Not just for us, but for everyone he's hurt." As he prepared the evidence for court, Ethan knew they were on the brink of something monumental. Granger's empire of deceit was crumbling, and this time, there would be no escape. The battle heats up. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, his mind racing. The USB drive Marcy Dillard had given him sat beside his laptop, almost glowing under the dim light of the kitchen. Inside it was the evidence that could expose Mr. Granger for the fraud and bully he was, a recording that captured his threats, his illegal tactics, and his callous disregard for his tenants. Sarah sat across from him, sipping tea nervously. "Are you sure this will hold up in court, Ethan?" she asked, worry etched deep into her features. "What if they try to say it was obtained illegally?" Ethan exhaled slowly. "It's not illegal, Mom. Marcy recorded it in a public setting, which means it's admissible." He ran a hand through his hair, exhaustion weighing him down. "But we need more than just this. If Granger's lawyer gets wind of this before we present it, they'll come up with some way to discredit it. We have to be ready." Sarah nodded, her face tightening with determination. "What's the next step?" Ethan pulled out his growing stack of files and flipped through them. "We need to track down more tenants who are willing to testify. We already have written statements, but testimony in court could be even stronger." Sarah bit her lip. "People are scared, Ethan. They've seen what Granger can do." "I know," Ethan said, his eyes darkening. But if we don't stand up to him now, he'll keep doing this forever. Just then, Ethan's phone buzzed. It was a text from Miss Thornton. Miss Thornton. Ethan, I spoke to a former building manager of one of Granger's properties. He's willing to talk. Can you meet tomorrow? Ethan's heart leaped. If they could get someone who worked inside Granger's operation to testify, it could strengthen their case exponentially. He quickly typed back, yes. Give me the time and place. Turning to his mom, he said, Mom, I think we just found our inside source. The next day, Ethan found himself sitting in a dingy diner on the edge of town. A man in his early 50s sat across from him, his hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug. His name was Dennis Caldwell, and he had worked for Granger for nearly a decade, until he'd had enough. Look, kid, Dennis said, his voice low and gravelly, Granger's a piece of work. I put up with a lot working for him, but I drew the line when he started pushing people out just so he could jack up the rent for new tenants. Ethan leaned forward eagerly. Did he ever tell you to fabricate violations? Dennis snorted. Told me. He ordered me. I was supposed to inspect apartments and find things wrong even if they weren't. If I couldn't find anything, I'd make something up. Loose wiring, leaking pipes, even fake pest infestations. Ethan's blood boiled. Do you have proof? Dennis nodded, pulling out a battered manila folder from his coat. Got some paperwork I kept. Emails, notes he left me. Even text messages where he told me to hit certain tenants harder because they were causing problems. You'll find your mom's name in there too. Ethan's stomach dropped, and he exchanged a glance with his mother, who had insisted on coming. Sarah's face hardened. He really wanted us gone that badly? She asked, her voice thick with emotion. Dennis sighed. Lady, Granger doesn't like tenants who know their rights. You stood up to him, and he wanted you out. Simple as that. Ethan carefully tucked the folder into his backpack. Dennis, would you be willing to testify? The older man hesitated, running a hand through his thinning hair. I ain't proud of what I did, but I ain't about to let him keep getting away with it, either. He sighed. Yeah, kid, I'll testify. Ethan grinned for the first time in days. Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. You won't regret this. Dennis smirked. I already do, kid. But I owe it to all the folks he hurt. Back home, Ethan and Sarah spread out their new evidence, carefully organizing everything for the upcoming hearing. Ethan felt the weight of the upcoming showdown pressing on his shoulders. But this time, they had enough to put Granger in a real bind. Later that night, as Ethan reviewed the audio file from the USB drive once again, he heard something he hadn't caught before. A name. You think you can stop me, lady? I've got Councilman Bennett in my pocket. You don't stand a chance. Ethan's eyes widened in shock. Councilman Bennett, a well-known local politician. If Granger had city officials backing him, it could explain why he had avoided serious consequences for so long. Ethan jumped out of his chair, rushing to Sarah. Mom, this goes deeper than just us. He's got people protecting him in the city. Sarah's face paled. What does that mean for us, Ethan? It means we have to be even more careful, Ethan replied, pacing the room. If this gets out before we can prove it in court, they'll do everything they can to silence us. Then what do we do? Sarah asked. Ethan exhaled deeply. We wait. We hold on to this, and we drop it in court when they least expect it. We have to make sure they can't bury it before the judge sees it. Sarah nodded solemnly. Then we keep pushing forward, no matter what. 2 days later, the courtroom was more packed than ever. Reporters had shown up after whispers of Granger's shady dealings began to spread in the community. Ethan sat with his mother, the evidence laid out before them, while Granger and Whittaker whispered heatedly at their table. Judge Reynolds entered, and the room fell silent. Let's continue, she said, adjusting her glasses. Mr. Matthews, do you have any new evidence to present? Ethan stood confidently. Yes, Your Honor. He walked to the front of the room and held up the manila folder. We have testimony from a former employee of Mr. Granger, outlining fraudulent inspection reports and targeted harassment of tenants. Whittaker shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay. Judge Reynolds held up a hand. I'll allow it. Proceed, Mr. Matthews. Dennis Caldwell took the stand, his testimony blunt and damning. He outlined years of deceit and fraud, and every word made Granger sink lower into his chair. But Ethan wasn't done. Your Honor, Ethan said, his heart pounding. I have one final piece of evidence. He played the audio recording. Granger's voice echoed through the silent courtroom. When the words Councilman Bennett rang out, a collective gasp rippled through the audience. Even Judge Reynolds' eyes widened slightly. Granger's face turned pale, and Whittaker scrambled to salvage what was left. Your Honor, we. Judge Reynolds raised a hand. Enough. Mr. Granger, this court takes allegations of corruption very seriously. She turned to Ethan. Mr. Matthews, this evidence is substantial. The court will reconvene to examine these new allegations in full. In the meantime, the eviction order is officially overturned. Sarah clutched Ethan's hand, tears of relief in her eyes. They had done it. But Ethan knew this fight wasn't over. Not yet. As Granger and Whittaker stormed out of the courtroom, Ethan whispered to his mom, We're just getting started. The final verdict. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension as the judge's gavel struck the wooden desk once more. The echoes of Granger's recorded threats still lingered in the room, and whispers rippled through the crowd of onlookers, journalists, and concerned tenants who had gathered to witness the conclusion of the case that had shaken their entire community. Ethan sat beside his mother, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. Sarah, though exhausted, sat with a quiet dignity Ethan had always admired. Today was the day that would decide everything. Would Granger finally be held accountable, or would the system once again favor the wealthy and powerful? Across the courtroom, Granger sat stiffly in his chair, his lawyer, Whittaker, whispering furiously in his ear. Gone was the smug confidence Granger had once carried. Now he looked like a cornered animal, waiting for the inevitable. Judge Reynolds cleared her throat, looking down at Ethan, with an expression that mixed sternness with something softer, respect. Mr. Matthews, do you have any final statements before I make my ruling? Ethan stood, his legs feeling heavier than they ever had before. He glanced at his mother, at Miss Thornton, at Dennis Caldwell, and finally at the tenants who had come to support them. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. Your Honor, Ethan began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. This case is about more than just my mom and me. It's about every tenant who has suffered at the hands of Mr. Granger's greed. People who have been scared, silenced, and forced out of their homes under false pretenses. He thought he could manipulate the system, that no one would fight back. But today we're proving that standing up for what's right, no matter how impossible it seems, matters. He paused for a moment, locking eyes with Granger, who glared back, his jaw clenched. Your Honor, Ethan continued, we have presented overwhelming evidence of Mr. Granger's illegal and unethical behavior. Falsified inspections, targeted evictions, and even connections to corruption within city government. All of it designed to exploit people like my mother, hard-working people who deserve better. Ethan swallowed hard, then finished with a quiet but firm statement. We ask the court to hold Mr. Granger accountable, not just for us, but for everyone he's hurt. As Ethan returned to his seat, Sarah squeezed his hand, pride shining in her eyes. Judge Reynolds nodded solemnly, turning her attention to Granger's table. Mr. Whittaker, does the defense have anything further to add? Whittaker stood, adjusting his tie nervously. Your Honor, while we acknowledge the court's concerns, we maintain that the eviction notice was lawful and that any claims of corruption are purely circumstantial. Circumstantial. Judge Reynolds interrupted sharply, raising an eyebrow. I heard clear, incriminating audio evidence of your client's misconduct. Mr. Whittaker, I strongly suggest you reconsider your approach." Whittaker's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Granger shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face flushed with anger. Judge Reynolds leaned forward. "Mr. Granger, do you have anything to say for yourself before I make my ruling?" Granger stood, smoothing his expensive suit with trembling hands. He forced a tight smile. "Your Honor, this has all been blown out of proportion. I run a business. Sometimes tough decisions have to be made." He shot a venomous glance at Ethan. "And sometimes people stick their noses where they don't belong." Ethan didn't flinch. He stared right back. Judge Reynolds sighed, rubbing her temples. "I've heard enough." The courtroom fell into a deafening silence as she shuffled through her notes, her eyes scanning the evidence before her. Finally, she spoke. "In the matter of Matthews v. Granger Properties, I find in favor of the plaintiffs." Sarah gasped, and Ethan's heart leaped into his throat. Furthermore, Judge Reynolds continued, "Mr. Granger's conduct has been found to be deceptive, fraudulent, and in violation of multiple housing laws. Effective immediately, the eviction order against the Matthews family is permanently revoked. Additionally, Mr. Granger will be subject to a full financial audit of his properties, and a formal investigation into his dealings with city officials will commence." The courtroom erupted into applause and murmurs of relief. Sarah covered her mouth in disbelief, tears brimming in her eyes. Ethan exhaled a deep, shuddering breath, the weight of months of stress finally lifting from his shoulders. Granger, however, looked livid. He slammed a fist onto the table and turned to Whittaker. "This isn't over," he hissed before storming out of the courtroom, his lawyer scrambling after him. Judge Reynolds offered Ethan a small nod. "Mr. Matthews, I commend your determination and dedication to justice. I hope you continue to pursue your passion for the law." Ethan, his face flushed with pride, nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor." The aftermath. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, microphones flashing in front of Ethan and Sarah. "Ethan, how does it feel to have won against such a powerful landlord? What's next for your family? Did you expect to uncover corruption within the city government?" Ethan held up his hands, smiling. "We're just glad justice was served. This was never just about us. It was about standing up for everyone who couldn't." Sarah hugged him tightly, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm so proud of you, Ethan. I don't know what I would have done without you." Miss Thornton approached them with a warm smile. "You did good, kid. And if you ever want to pursue a future in law, I know a few people who'd love to help." Ethan smiled, his mind racing with the possibilities. He had never imagined himself as a lawyer before, but after everything he'd been through, the thought didn't seem so crazy anymore. Dennis Caldwell walked up, shaking Ethan's hand. "You did what I couldn't, kid. You took him down." Ethan grinned. "I couldn't have done it without your help, Mr. Caldwell." Dennis chuckled. "Call me Dennis. And hey, if you ever need a maintenance guy, I know a thing or two." A new beginning. That night, back in their small apartment, Sarah stood at the kitchen counter, her hands resting on the eviction notice that had once filled her with dread. Now it was nothing more than a crumpled piece of paper. She slowly tore it into pieces, a triumphant smile playing on her lips. Ethan sat at the table, flipping through legal books with newfound purpose. His fight with Granger had lit a fire in him, one that wouldn't easily fade. "Mom," he said, looking up with a grin, "I think I might actually want to study law." Sarah's smile widened, tears of joy in her eyes. "I think you'd be amazing at it." And for the first time in a long time, their small apartment felt like home again, safe, secure, and filled with hope. As Ethan stared out the window, watching the city lights flicker, he realized that standing up for what's right wasn't just something people said. It was something that could change lives. And he was ready for whatever came next.